June 17, 1944. A maintenance depot 3 miles inland from Omaha Beach, Sergeant Curtis Culin crouched beside a pile of twisted German steel, running his hand along a salvaged beach obstacle while around him the war machine ground itself to pieces against an enemy no one had planned for. The obstacle was a Czech hedgehog, 3 steel I-beams welded together to form a 6-pointed star, designed to rip open landing craft. It had failed at that purpose 11 days ago when American forces stormed ashore. But the steel was good. High-grade structural beams, each about 6 feet long, are already cut to convenient lengths. Culin wasn't thinking about regulations or proper procurement channels. He was thinking about yesterday, when he'd watched a Sherman tank from his own unit attempt to climb a hedgerow near Sainte-Mère-Église. The tank had gotten halfway up the ancient earthen wall before its belly armor exposed itself to the sky. A German soldier, invisible in the next field, had fired a single Panzerfaust rocket. The shaped charge had punched through the thin underbelly armor and ignited the fuel. The crew had 8 seconds to escape. Only 2 made it out. Their screams still echoed in Culin's ears. What Culin was about to do was explicitly forbidden by United States Army regulations. Unauthorized modification of military equipment could result in court-martial. Tanks were manufactured to precise specifications at factories in Detroit and shipped across the Atlantic at enormous cost. The idea that a sergeant with a welding torch could improve them was not just wrong, it was dangerous. It established a precedent where every soldier might start customizing equipment based on personal preference, creating a logistical nightmare of non-standard configurations that would be impossible to maintain or supply. But Curtis Culin had been a cab driver in Cranford, New Jersey before the war. He'd spent years keeping vehicles running with improvised repairs and whatever parts he could scavenge. He understood something that the engineers in Detroit did not. Sometimes the manual is wrong, sometimes survival requires breaking rules, and sometimes a pile of scrap metal contains the solution to a problem that's killing your friends. The hedgerows of Normandy were destroying the American army, not the German army, the hedgerows themselves. Ancient agricultural boundaries that had stood for 1,000 years, earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that formed a vast maze across the Norman countryside. Each field was a separate fortress. Each hedgerow was a natural defensive wall that turned American advantages in mobility and firepower into liabilities. Sherman tanks, designed for mobile warfare across open terrain, became death traps in the bocage. Infantry, trained for combined arms operations with armor support, found themselves fighting World War I-style trench warfare in a green labyrinth where every advance cost blood. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem was simple to describe and impossible to solve. A typical Norman hedgerow consisted of an earthen bank 3 to 6 feet high, packed solid as concrete by centuries of compression, reinforced by root systems that penetrated 10 or 15 feet deep into clay-heavy soil. On top of this, earthen rampart grew oak trees, hawthorn bushes, brambles and thorns that intertwined into barriers 15 feet high. The roots didn't just grow down, they grew laterally through the earthen bank, creating a reinforced structure stronger than most man-made fortifications. When a Sherman tank attempted to cross a hedgerow, it had 2 options, both fatal. First option, try to crash through the obstacle by brute force. The tank would strike the hedgerow at speed, hoping its 33 tons of weight and 400 horsepower engine could smash through the earthen wall. This never worked. The hedgerows were too strong, too deeply rooted. The tank would hit the obstacle and simply stop, engine roaring uselessly, tracks churning mud, while the crew sat trapped in a disabled vehicle waiting for German anti-tank weapons to find them. Second option, attempt to climb over the hedgerow. This was the standard technique taught in training, based on the assumption that obstacles could be surmounted rather than penetrated. The tank would back up to gain speed, then accelerate toward the hedgerow at 10 or 15 miles per hour. The front of the tank would rise as it climbed the earthen bank, tilting backward at an angle of 30 or 40 degrees. For a few seconds, the tank would be perched on top of the obstacle, treads spinning in the air, completely immobilized. This was the moment when German soldiers killed American tankers. A German infantryman with a Panzerfaust, positioned in the next field with a clear line of sight, would hear the Sherman's engine roaring as it climbed the hedgerow. He would see the front of the tank rise above the vegetation, and when the belly armor was exposed, the thin steel plate that protected the underside of the vehicle, he would fire. The Panzerfaust could penetrate nearly 6 inches of armor. Against the Sherman's 1-inch belly plate, it was devastatingly effective. One rocket was usually sufficient to ignite fuel or detonate ammunition. The tank would brew up, as crews called it, erupting in flames that gave the crew perhaps 10 seconds to escape before the interior became an incinerator. Tank losses in the first 2 weeks after D-Day were catastrophic. The 2nd Armoured Division, which landed in Normandy on June 9th, lost 73 tanks in the first 10 days of combat. The 3rd Armoured Division, arriving on June 23rd, lost over 200 tanks in its first month of operations. Some companies were losing 50 or 60% of their armour within the first week. Replacement tanks were arriving from supply depots and being destroyed within 48 hours. Experienced crews were being killed faster than the replacement system could provide new tankers. The human cost was measured not just in destroyed vehicles, but in burning men. When a Sherman took a penetrating hit to the belly armor, the interior temperature could reach over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. Ammunition cooked off in chain reactions that blew turrets completely off hulls. Fuel, high-octane aviation gasoline stored in sponsons on either side of the crew compartment, ignited instantly when exposed to the superheated air and molten metal fragments created by armor penetration. Crews had perhaps 8 to 10 seconds to bail out through hatches before the fire consumed them. Many didn't make it. Tank commanders who survived reported hearing their crew members screaming over the intercom as they burned, trapped inside a steel coffin they couldn't escape. The psychological impact was devastating. Tankers became fatalistic, making dark jokes about how long they expected to survive. Replacement crews arriving at units were terrified before they ever saw combat, because veterans would tell them the truth about what happened when Shermans encountered hedgerows. Some men refused to enter their assigned tanks, requiring officers to threaten them with court-martial. Others climbed into their Shermans each morning with the resigned certainty that they were already dead, just waiting for a German rocket to make it official. American commanders understood the crisis. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, received casualty reports that used words like unsustainable and catastrophic. Staff officers calculated that at current loss rates, entire armoured divisions would be combat ineffective within 6 weeks. The grand strategy that had guided 2 years of planning, the vision of rapid breakout and mobile warfare across France, was collapsing into the same kind of grinding attrition that had characterized World War I. The Allies had successfully invaded Fortress Europe, breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and established a massive beachhead, but they couldn't advance more than a few miles inland because medieval agricultural geography was defeating 20th-century military technology. Solutions were proposed, tested, and failed. Combat engineers attempted to blast gaps through hedgerows using explosives. This technique worked technically. A properly placed charge of TNT or Composition C could blow a hole through even the thickest hedgerow, but it was slow, taking 15 to 20 minutes per breach, and the explosions announced American intentions to every German within 2 miles. Enemy machine gunners and mortar teams would train their weapons on the gap before the smoke cleared, turning each breach into a pre-targeted killing zone. Bulldozer tanks, Sherman tanks fitted with heavy steel blades designed for clearing beach obstacles, proved equally ineffective. They were slower than standard Shermans, highly conspicuous, and became priority targets for German anti-tank gunners, who understood that destroying the bulldozers would deny Americans their primary means of obstacle clearance. The 2nd Armoured Division landed in Normandy with 14 bulldozer tanks. By early July, 11 of them had been destroyed. Artillery bombardment was tried. American gunners would saturate hedgerow lines with high-explosive shells, hoping to destroy the root systems and vegetation through sheer volume of fire. This consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, created massive craters that blocked tank movement, and often failed to create usable gaps. The hedgerows were too strong, too deeply rooted. They could absorb artillery fire that would obliterate concrete fortifications and remain essentially intact. The Ordnance Department, back in the United States, was working on redesigns. Engineers at Aberdeen, Proving Ground, were developing modified Sherman variants with improved belly armor and different track configurations. But these solutions would take months to design, test, manufacture, and ship to Europe. Men were dying today. The battle for Normandy was happening now. Waiting for Detroit to solve the problem meant accepting thousands more casualties. Into this crisis of failed solutions and mounting desperation came Curtis Culin, a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey, who had never attended engineering school, who had no formal training in armor design or obstacle clearance, who possessed nothing more than practical mechanical aptitude, a welder's torch, and a growing conviction that his friends were dying for lack of a solution so simple that everyone had missed it. Culin served with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. Reconnaissance units had particularly brutal jobs in the bocage. Their mission required them to probe enemy positions, which meant being first into unknown territory, first to encounter ambushes, first to discover where Germans had positioned their anti-tank weapons. The 102nd had been in combat since June 9th. Culin had watched too many crews burn. The idea came during a conversation that couldn't be precisely dated, somewhere around June 13th or 14th. Culin was discussing the hedgerow problem with other soldiers in his unit, probably tankers and mechanics, men who understood the technical challenges and shared his frustration at the lack of solutions. The conversation was informal, just soldiers venting, proposing impossible ideas, sharing dark humor about their situation. Someone mentioned the German beach obstacles. Thousands of them littered the invasion beaches and the roads leading inland. Czech hedgehogs made from welded steel I-beams, Belgian gates constructed from steel rails, tetrahedrons of structural steel designed to rip open landing craft hulls. All of them failed now, pushed aside or destroyed during the landing, piled up in salvage yards waiting to be shipped back to England for recycling. High-quality structural steel, already cut to convenient lengths, available in essentially unlimited quantities. Culin looked at those obstacles differently than anyone else. He didn't see scrap metal waiting for recycling. He saw the raw material for a weapon. If you welded steel prongs to the front of a Sherman tank, extending forward like tusks, and angled them downward so they struck the base of a hedgerow rather than the top, then, when the tank drove forward at full power, those prongs would act like giant knives cutting into the earthen bank. The roots would tear, the soil would collapse, the hedgerow would fall forward, and the tank could drive through the breach at ground level, never climbing, never exposing its vulnerable belly armor. The concept was mechanically sound. The execution would violate half a dozen regulations. Culin didn't care. He had watched men burn. He had attended memorial services for crews whose bodies couldn't be recovered because their tanks were still too hot to approach. He had listened to replacement tankers ask in terrified voices whether the rumors were true, whether Shermans really burned as easily as everyone said. He was done waiting for official solutions. On or around June 15th, 1944, Culin approached his company commander with rough sketches and an explanation of his concept. The captain, whose name has not been preserved in historical records but who made a decision that would change the course of the war, gave immediate approval. Within hours, Culin had access to a Sherman tank for experiments, welding equipment from the unit maintenance section, and authorization to organize a work party to retrieve steel beams from a salvage yard near Omaha Beach. What happened next occurred with a speed that military bureaucracies are not supposed to achieve. The prototype took 3 days to construct, 72 hours from concept to working device. 3 days to solve a problem that had defeated the entire American military establishment for 2 weeks. Culin selected 4 sections of steel I-beam from the salvage yard, each approximately 5 feet long, weighing about 100 pounds. He used cutting torches to bevel the forward ends of the beams, creating angled cutting edges that would bite into earth and roots more effectively than blunt ends. He welded a horizontal crossbar to hold the 4 prongs in position, spacing them evenly across the width of the tank's front hull. Then he welded the entire assembly, prongs and crossbar together, to the lower front armor plate of the Sherman, positioning it so the prongs projected forward and angled slightly downward. The result looked crude, almost comical. 4 steel tusks jutting from the tank's nose like the horns of some mechanical beast. The welds were rough, unpolished, done in the field with whatever equipment was available. The prongs were slightly asymmetric because the salvaged beams weren't perfectly matched. The entire contraption had the appearance of something cobbled together by desperate men with no idea what they were doing. It worked perfectly. The first test occurred on July 11, 1944, in a field near Isigny-sur-Mer, several miles inland from Omaha Beach. Perhaps 20 soldiers gathered to watch, mostly tankers and officers from Culin's unit. Most expected failure. They had seen too many proposed solutions to the hedgerow problem, all of which had failed in one way or another. Steel prongs welded to a tank seemed unlikely to succeed where explosives and bulldozers had failed. The test hedgerow was selected carefully. Not an unusually weak example that might give false results, but a representative obstacle. About 4 feet high at the earthen base, topped with 15 feet of mature vegetation, including oak trees with trunks 4 or 5 inches in diameter. This was a typical Norman hedgerow, the kind American tankers encountered dozens of times every day. The Sherman backed up to gain speed. The driver, whose name was not recorded, was understandably nervous. If the device failed, if the tank bellied up on the hedgerow, as so many had before, he and his crew might become the next casualties. But he trusted Sergeant Culin, who had explained the theory carefully and seemed confident it would work. The driver shifted into gear, advanced the throttle, and aimed directly at the hedgerow. 5 miles per hour, 8, 10. The tank hit the hedgerow with the prongs leading. There was a sound like heavy canvas tearing, a deep ripping noise as steel cut through earth and roots. The prongs bit into the earthen bank and penetrated deep. For a moment it seemed the tank might stall, stopped by the resistance of the obstacle. Then the engine roared. The driver gave it full throttle. The tank's treads gripped the ground and pushed forward. Earth fountained upward, blown up and over the tank's hull by the force of the breach. Branches snapped, tree trunks splintered, vegetation showered down on the turret and rear deck. And then, less than 5 seconds after impact, the Sherman burst through to the other side of the hedgerow, trailing broken branches and torn roots, otherwise completely undamaged. The tank had not climbed the obstacle. It had cut through at ground level, exactly as Culin had predicted. The watching soldiers erupted in cheers. Some were crying, not from sadness but from relief and hope. For 2 weeks they had watched friends die in futile attempts to breach these obstacles. For 2 weeks they had felt helpless against terrain that seemed unconquerable. Now, suddenly, impossibly, a simple device made from scrap metal had solved the problem. Word spread through the 2nd Armoured Division like wildfire. Tank commanders started appearing at the maintenance area, asking to see the modified Camine, Sherman. Officers from other units began requesting similar modifications. By June 18th, perhaps 72 hours after the first successful test, multiple tanks in the 2nd Armoured were receiving Culin-style prongs. The modifications were still technically unauthorized. Nobody had submitted paperwork. Nobody had received official approval from the Ordnance Department or Army headquarters. Mechanics were just doing it because it worked and because their friends were dying without it. This was military innovation at its most raw and desperate. Not planned, not approved, not tested through proper channels. Just soldiers solving problems with whatever tools they had because the alternative was unacceptable. The design evolved rapidly through practical testing. Some units tried 3 prongs, others tried 6. Angles were adjusted based on field results. Welding techniques improved as mechanics gained experience. Tank crews discovered that the prongs also provided unexpected protection against Panzerfaust rockets. The steel teeth could detonate shaped charges prematurely, before they struck the main armor. This wasn't intended, but battlefield testing proved it worked. Within days, the modification was spreading beyond the 2nd Armoured to other divisions. The 3rd Armoured Division heard about it around June 20th. Within 48 hours, Their maintenance battalions were scavenging German beach obstacles and modifying every available Sherman. The 1st Infantry Division, 4th Infantry Division, 29th Infantry Division. Wherever American armor operated in the bocage, mechanics were welding steel prongs onto Shermans. Nobody was asking permission because everyone understood that official approval would take weeks or months. The Army's procurement system was designed for deliberate, centralized decision-making. Modifications had to be tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground, reviewed by Ordnance Department committees, approved by multiple levels of command, then manufactured at authorized facilities. This process ensured quality control and standardization. It was also completely incompatible with battlefield urgency. Culin's design was being validated not in testing facilities, but in actual combat, and the validation was undeniable. Tanks with prongs survived, tanks without them burned. The choice was obvious, even if it meant breaking every regulation in the manual. By early July, hundreds of Sherman tanks across Normandy had been modified with improvised hedgerow cutters. An unauthorized revolution was sweeping through the American armored force, spreading laterally through word of mouth and direct observation. No official directive, no procurement contract, no centralized manufacturing, just mechanics with welding torches working around the clock because the alternative was watching their comrades die. What Curtis Culin had created in 72 hours with scrap metal and a welding torch was about to change the course of World War II. The stalemate that had threatened to turn the Normandy invasion into another World War I bloodbath was about to break. And it would break because one sergeant from New Jersey had looked at a pile of German beach obstacles and seen not scrap metal, but salvation. The modified tanks looked fearsome with their new equipment. 4 steel prongs projecting from each hull gave the Shermans an aggressive, predatory appearance. Soldiers began calling them Rhino tanks, drawing the obvious comparison to the horned animals of Africa. The name stuck. Within days, everyone in the American Army knew what a Rhino tank was. The question was whether the High Command would allow them to continue existing, or whether regulations and bureaucracy would shut down the most successful battlefield innovation of the war. July 14, 1944, 3 miles southwest of Saint-Lô, France. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood with his arms crossed, watching a Sherman tank back away, from a hedgerow that had stopped American advances cold for 6 weeks. Around him stood a small group of officers, including Major General Leonard Gero, commander of 5th Corps, and several ordnance specialists who had been summoned to witness what might be either a breakthrough or another failed experiment. Bradley had initially dismissed the reports when they first crossed his desk. Another improvised solution from desperate tankers, probably as ineffective as all the others. But Major General Edward Brooks, commanding the 2nd Armoured Division, had insisted this was different. Brooks was a competent, aggressive commander who understood armour tactics. If he said something was worth seeing, it probably was. The Sherman that Bradley was watching had 4 steel prongs welded to its bow, jutting forward like tusks. The welds were rough, clearly done in the field. The prongs themselves looked like they'd been salvaged from German beach obstacles, cut and shaped with whatever tools were available. The entire contraption violated so many regulations that Bradley's ordnance officers were already preparing objections. Unauthorized modification of equipment, non-standard configuration, potential structural weaknesses, warranty issues. Bradley didn't care about any of that. He cared about one thing. Did it work? The tank's engine roared to life. The driver shifted into gear and accelerated directly at the hedgerow. 10 miles per hour. 15. The steel prongs struck the hedgerow with a sound like tearing canvas, a noise that would become familiar to American tankers across France in the coming weeks. Earth and roots exploded upward in a fountain of dirt. The tank did not climb or tilt. It drove straight through, its prongs cutting into the base of the hedgerow like enormous knives through tough fabric. In less than 5 seconds, the Sherman burst through to the other side, trailing broken branches and torn vegetation, otherwise undamaged, its belly armour never exposed to enemy fire. Bradley's staff officers erupted in cheers. Ordnance specialists scrambled to examine the hedgerow, measuring the breach, checking for damage to the tank. The general himself remained silent for a moment, his mind already calculating implications. If this device worked reliably, if it could be manufactured in quantity, if it could be installed on enough tanks before the planned offensive, then perhaps Operation Cobra could succeed. Perhaps the stalemate could be broken. He turned to Lieutenant Colonel John Medaris, his chief ordnance officer, and spoke words that would change the course of the war. I want these devices manufactured and fitted to as many tanks as possible. Every Sherman, every Stuart, every tank destroyer we can modify. I want them ready before Operation Cobra launches. Round-the-clock production. Use every ordnance unit, every maintenance depot, every welder we have. This is top priority. Medaris, a West Point graduate with extensive logistics experience, understood immediately that this was not a routine production job. This was an emergency crash program that might determine the outcome of the entire Normandy campaign. He also understood something else. What Bradley had just authorized was the legitimization of an unauthorized modification that had already spread to hundreds of tanks across multiple divisions. The High Command wasn't approving an innovation. They were catching up to one that had already succeeded. The production effort that followed was unprecedented in its speed and scale. Bradley wanted these devices on as many tanks as possible before Operation Cobra launched on July 25th. That gave them 11 days to manufacture hundreds of devices, transport them to units scattered across Normandy, and weld them onto tanks. It meant mobilizing every ordnance unit, every maintenance depot, every welder in the American sector. It meant improvising a mass production system for a device that had been invented less than 3 weeks earlier. Medaris returned to his headquarters and within hours had issued orders that set the program in motion. Every ordnance company, maintenance battalion, and repair depot in the American sector received orders on July 14th to begin immediate production of hedgerow cutting devices. Specifications were transmitted by telephone and radio. 4 steel prongs, approximately 5 feet long, made from German beech obstacle steel, beveled cutting edges on the forward ends, crossbar to hold prongs in position. The entire assembly was welded to the lower front hull of the tank. The specifications were simple enough that any competent welder could fabricate the device, but complex enough that skill and care were required to ensure the welds would hold under combat stress. More importantly, the specifications were describing what mechanics had already been building for weeks. The Army wasn't designing something new. They were standardizing something that had emerged organically from the bottom up. The raw material was abundant. Salvage yards behind the beaches contained thousands of tons of steel from destroyed German obstacles. Trucks began hauling steel beams to ordnance units across Normandy. The beams arrived in bundles, still covered with rust and barnacles from their time underwater, some still showing damage from explosives or shell fire. Ordnance troops would sort through the beams, selecting those that were straight and undamaged, rejecting any that showed cracks or severe corrosion. The welding work was brutal. Summer heat in Normandy in July 1944 reached into the 80s and 90s Fahrenheit. Welders worked in heavy leather protective gear, wearing face shields and gloves, manipulating steel beams that weighed over 100 pounds each. The work was done outdoors or in canvas-sheltered areas because there was no time to set up proper workshops. Each device required multiple hours of welding. The 4 prongs had to be welded to the crossbar. The crossbar had to be welded to the tank's hull. Every weld had to be strong enough to withstand the enormous forces generated when the tank drove into a hedgerow at full speed. A weak weld could fail at the moment of impact, potentially causing the tank to belly up on the obstacle exactly as unmodified tanks did. So the welders worked carefully despite the pressure, despite the heat, despite the urgency. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day. Welders worked 6-hour shifts, then rested while other crews took over. Acetylene tanks and welding rods had to be trucked in constantly to keep production going. The entire system operated with the kind of flexible improvisation that characterized American military logistics at its best. There were no detailed plans, no carefully calculated production schedules. There was only the urgent need to produce as many devices as possible before Operation Cobra launched. When one ordnance company ran low on materials, trucks would be dispatched to transfer supplies from units that had excess. When welders became exhausted, replacements were pulled from other jobs. The priority was absolute. Tank crews from combat units would drive their vehicles to the nearest ordnance facility, wait while the device was fabricated and installed, then drive back to their units. Some crews waited 6 or 8 hours. Others waited overnight. But they waited because they knew the device might save their lives. Tankers who had lost friends to Panzerfaust fire when tanks bellied up on hedgerows understood that Culin's device could prevent those deaths. They were willing to wait as long as necessary to get their tanks modified. The modified tanks began appearing in combat units in mid-July. At first, there were just a handful per battalion. Crews with modified tanks would volunteer for the most dangerous missions, testing the devices under actual combat conditions. The reports that came back were uniformly positive. The devices worked exactly as demonstrated. Tanks could breach hedgerows in seconds without exposing their vulnerable undersides. Tank commanders could choose their own routes through the bocage rather than being forced to follow roads or search for gaps that might be covered by German fire. The tactical flexibility was transformative. German defensive positions that had been carefully planned around the assumption that American tanks would be channeled into predictable routes suddenly became obsolete. Rhino tanks could appear anywhere, from any direction, breaking through hedgerows that Germans had assumed were impassable barriers. By July 20th, 5 days before Operation Cobra was scheduled to begin, approximately 300 tanks in the First Army had been fitted with Culin's device. This represented about 15% of American armor in the theater. It wasn't enough. Bradley wanted more. Medaris pushed production harder. More ordnance units were diverted from other tasks. More welders were pulled from maintenance work and set to manufacturing hedgerow cutters. The pace became frantic, desperate, driven by the knowledge that Operation Cobra was approaching, and every tank without a device was a tank that might be stopped by the bocage. By July 24th, the day before Operation Cobra launched, approximately 500 devices had been manufactured and installed on American tanks. This represented nearly 60% of the Sherman medium tanks, Stuart light tanks, and M10 tank destroyers that would participate in the offensive. It wasn't 100%, there hadn't been enough time, but it was enough. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The British forces, observing the American modification and recognizing its value, quickly developed their own version. British ordnance units called their devices prongs and began manufacturing them from German beach obstacles, using exactly the same source material the Americans had discovered. By August, British prongs were being fitted to Sherman tanks in the British sector, though British production never reached the scale of the American effort. The Germans, encountering Rhino tanks in combat for the first time during Operation Cobra, had no official designation for them. German after-action reports and prisoner interrogations referred to them variously as American hedgerow tanks, tanks with steel horns, or simply the modified Shermans. What was clear from German accounts was that the appearance of these devices was a nasty surprise. German defensive tactics in the bocage had relied heavily on the assumption that American tanks could not maneuver effectively through hedgerow country. When that assumption proved false, German defenses collapsed far more rapidly than they might have otherwise. July 25th, 1944. 9:40 in the morning. The sky over Normandy filled with the sound of approaching aircraft. More than 1,500 B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, flying in formations so large they darkened. The sky approached their targets in a rectangular area northwest of Saint-Lô. The bombers had taken off from bases in England hours earlier, climbing to altitude over the English Channel, forming up into their massive formations, then flying south across the invasion beaches toward their assigned target zones. The target area for the carpet bombing was a rectangle approximately 5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide between the towns of Marigny and Hebercrevon. This was the sector held by German forces directly in the path of the planned American offensive. The bombing was intended to obliterate German defenses, destroy command and control networks, kill or stun German soldiers, and create chaos that would allow American ground forces to penetrate deep into German rear areas before effective resistance could be organized. The bombardment began at exactly 9:40. The first bomber wings released their loads from altitude. High explosive bombs and fragmentation bombs fell in a deadly rain. The effect on the ground was apocalyptic. Bombs weighing 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, even 2,000 pounds detonated in rapid succession. The earth heaved and shook. Trees were blown to splinters. Hedgerows were obliterated. Buildings collapsed. German soldiers caught in the open or in inadequate shelters were killed instantly by blast or shredded by flying fragments. Those who survived the initial explosions were left stunned, deafened, unable to think or function. The bombing continued for nearly an hour. Wave after wave of heavy bombers passed over the target area, each plane releasing its bombs, then turning for the flight back to England. Following the heavy bombers came approximately 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers, carrying incendiary bombs and additional high explosives. By the time the last aircraft departed, approximately 3,300 tons of high explosive bombs and 60,000 incendiary bombs had been dropped on the target area. The landscape was transformed into a ruined moonscape of overlapping craters, splintered trees, and burning debris. The precision that bombardiers had hoped for proved impossible to achieve. The target area was close to American front lines, separated in some places by only a few hundred yards. Thick clouds obscured visibility. Some bombs fell short of the target zone, landing instead on American positions. The results were tragic. 111 American soldiers were killed, and nearly 500 wounded by bombs from their own aircraft. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie James McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat in the European theatre during World War II. Despite these tragic losses, the bombardment achieved its primary objective. German defences in the target area were effectively destroyed. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite German armoured formations defending the sector, was reduced to a remnant of its former strength. Approximately 1,000 German soldiers were killed in the bombardment. Dozens of command posts were destroyed, obliterating the command and control network that coordinated German defences. Communications were cut. Survivors emerged from their shelters stunned, deafened, many suffering from concussion and shock. Into this chaos, American ground forces advanced. The 7th Corps, commanded by Major General J. Lawton Collins, formed the main thrust of Operation Cobra. Collins was one of the most aggressive and competent corps commanders in the American Army, a man who understood the importance of maintaining momentum and exploiting success. His nickname was Lightning Joe, earned during fighting in the Pacific, and it reflected his tactical philosophy of speed and violence of action. 3 infantry divisions formed the assault force, the 4th Infantry Division on the right flank, the 9th Infantry Division in the centre, the 30th Infantry Division on the left. These divisions had been fighting in Normandy since D-Day. They were experienced, battle-hardened, and grimly determined. Behind the infantry divisions waited 2 armoured divisions, the 2nd Armoured Division and the 3rd Armoured Division. These divisions contained the bulk of American armour that would participate in Operation Cobra, and a substantial portion of their Sherman tanks, approximately 60%, were now equipped with Curtis Culin's hedgerow cutting devices. The infantry assault began in the early afternoon of July 25th, several hours after the bombing ended. American troops advanced through the devastated landscape, moving cautiously at first, expecting German resistance to materialize at any moment. But the resistance was disorganized and weak. German soldiers who had survived the bombardment were in no condition to mount effective defense. Many were still stunned, sitting in bomb craters, unable to comprehend what had happened. The initial advance on July 25th penetrated approximately 1 mile beyond the start line. This was slower than hoped, evidence that even the massive bombardment had not completely eliminated German resistance. Hedgerows, even when damaged by bombing, still provided some defensive value. American infantry still had to clear German positions field by field in brutal close-quarters combat. But the resistance was not the organized, coordinated defense that had stopped previous American attacks. This was the fighting of scattered survivors, individual acts of courage or desperation rather than systematic defense in depth. Major General Collins, monitoring the advance from his forward command post, recognized something that others might have missed. The German resistance, though still deadly, was not coherent. There was no defensive plan being executed, no coordinated counterattacks, no systematic attempt to establish new defensive positions. The German command structure had been destroyed by the bombardment. Units were fighting in isolation, without support, without direction. The German front line was not bending under American pressure. It was breaking. Late in the afternoon of July 25th, Collins made the bold decision that would transform Operation Cobra from a limited offensive into a breakthrough that changed the entire Normandy campaign. He ordered his 2 armoured divisions to begin their exploitation immediately, ahead of the original schedule. The plan had called for infantry to open a wide corridor before armour advanced, but Collins saw that waiting might allow the Germans time to recover, to establish new defensive positions, and to bring up reinforcements. He decided to commit his armour while the Germans were still reeling from the bombardment, gambling that American tanks could exploit the chaos before German defences could solidify. The armoured exploitation began at dawn on July 26th. Combat Command A of the 2nd Armoured Division, led by Brigadier General Maurice Rose, drove south from the Saint-Lô area with orders to advance as far and as fast as possible. Rose was an aggressive commander who understood armoured warfare and knew how to exploit success. His column consisted of Sherman tanks, tank destroyers, armoured infantry and half-tracks, and self-propelled artillery. And crucially, the majority of his tanks were equipped with Culin's hedgerow cutting devices. For the first time since D-Day, American armour operated with true mobility and freedom of manoeuvre in the Norman bocage. The Rhino tanks crashed through hedgerow after hedgerow, choosing their own routes, avoiding German strongpoints, exploiting gaps in the disintegrated German defence. Tank commanders no longer needed to follow roads where German anti-tank guns might be positioned. They no longer needed to search for gaps in hedgerows that might be covered by German fire. They simply drove cross-country, breaching obstacles at will, maintaining momentum, preventing Germans from establishing new defensive positions. The psychological impact on German forces was catastrophic. For 6 weeks, German defenders had relied on the bocage as their primary defensive advantage. They had used the hedgerows to channel American attacks into predetermined killing zones. They had positioned anti-tank weapons to cover the few routes through which American armour could advance. Now, suddenly, impossibly, American tanks were appearing from unexpected directions, breaking through hedgerows that Germans had assumed were impassable barriers. The entire German defensive system, carefully constructed over weeks of combat, was rendered obsolete in a single day. German attempts at counterattack proved futile. Small groups of German infantry, attempting to block American advances, found themselves bypassed and isolated as American tanks drove through hedgerows on either side of their positions. German anti-tank guns, carefully positioned to cover roads and known passages, found their fields of fire blocked by hedgerows, while American tanks emerged from directions the Germans had not anticipated. German officers attempting to coordinate defense found themselves unable to predict where American armour would appear next. By midday on July 26th, lead elements of the 2nd Armoured Division had advanced 6 miles beyond the start line. 6 miles in half a day. This was farther than the entire First Army had managed to advance in the previous 2 weeks of grinding attritional combat. The contrast was stark and dramatic. The town of Marigny, a significant road junction 6 kilometres south of the start line, fell to the 1st Infantry Division, supported by the 3rd Armoured Division. German prisoners, many of them reinforcements who had just arrived from training battalions in Germany, surrendered in such numbers that American units simply directed them to walk to the rear without guards. There were not enough military police to process them all. By July 27th, the American advance accelerated. The 30th Infantry Division reported in words that would become famous, "This thing has busted wide open." The 3rd Armoured Division reached the area around Coutances, a critical road junction approximately 15 miles behind what had been the German front line just 2 days earlier. German forces attempting to withdraw south to avoid encirclement found their routes blocked by American armor that had already penetrated deep into their rear areas. Entire German units were cut off, surrounded, destroyed, or forced to surrender. The breakthrough, achieved by July 28, exceeded even Bradley's optimistic projections. American forces had penetrated more than 20 miles beyond the start line in just 3 days. The German 7th Army, which had fought the Americans to a standstill for 6 weeks in the bocage, was in full retreat, its units scattered and disorganized, its command structure shattered, its ability to conduct coordinated defense destroyed. The bocage, the nightmare terrain that had seemed to make sustained offensive operations impossible, was now behind American lines. Ahead lay the relatively open country of central France, where American mobility and firepower advantages could be employed without restriction. Post-battle analysis conducted by American intelligence officers in the weeks following Operation Cobra revealed the decisive role of the Rhino tanks. Staff officers examined after-action reports, interviewed unit commanders, and compiled statistics on how Hedgerows had been breached during the offensive. The conclusion was clear and dramatic. Approximately 70% of successful hedgerow breaches during Operation Cobra were accomplished by tanks equipped with Culin's devices. The remaining 30% required engineer support with explosives, bulldozers, or manual labor, all of which were significantly slower and more vulnerable to German defensive fire. Tank crews reported that the Culin devices allowed them to breach typical Norman hedgerows in less than 10 seconds from initial impact to emergence on the far side. This speed was absolutely critical to maintaining momentum and preventing German forces from repositioning to counter each breach. Previous methods of breaching hedgerows had required anywhere from 10 minutes to half an hour, allowing Germans to prepare defensive fire against any breach. American tanks equipped with Culin devices also suffered significantly fewer casualties than unmodified tanks operating in the same terrain. Ordnance officers analyzing loss rates found that Rhino tanks experienced approximately 40% fewer tank kills than standard tanks in bocage terrain. The primary reason was simple. Modified tanks did not expose their vulnerable belly armor when crossing hedgerows, eliminating the single most common cause of tank losses in the bocage. The strategic impact of Operation Cobra was immediate, dramatic, and far-reaching. By July 31st, just 6 days after the offensive began, 8th Corps had captured the town of Avranches, described by military historians as the gateway to Brittany and southern Normandy. The capture of Avranches opened routes south into Brittany and east toward central France. The entire Normandy front, which had been static for 6 weeks, suddenly collapsed. On August 1, 1944, the 3rd United States Army was officially activated under the command of Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. Patton was one of the most aggressive and controversial American commanders, a man who understood armored warfare and believed in rapid exploitation and deep penetration. 3rd Army's mission was to exploit the breakthrough achieved by 1st Army, racing south into Brittany to capture the ports and east toward the Seine River to encircle German forces still fighting in Normandy. Patton's 3rd Army advanced with a speed that astonished both American and German commanders. Armored columns raced across France, sometimes covering 50 miles in a single day, bypassing German strongpoints, leaving isolated German units to be mopped up by following infantry. The war of attrition that had characterized Normandy from D-Day to late July was replaced almost overnight by a war of maneuver, where American advantages in mobility, logistics, and air power could be fully exploited. The liberation of Paris followed on August 25, just 1 month after Operation Cobra began. The encirclement and destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket, completed in mid-August, trapped between 50,000 and 100,000 German soldiers, and destroyed the combat effectiveness of entire divisions. The Wehrmacht in France never recovered from this catastrophic defeat. For Curtis Culin, recognition came in forms both official and bittersweet. General Omar Bradley personally recommended Culin for the Legion of Merit, a decoration typically reserved for officers who had distinguished themselves through exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. The citation accompanying the award praised Culin's contribution to the success of Operation Cobra and noted that his invention had saved countless American lives by restoring tactical mobility to American armored forces at a critical moment in the campaign. The award ceremony occurred in early August, somewhere in Normandy, probably at a headquarters area behind the rapidly advancing front lines. Bradley himself pinned the medal on Culin's uniform, shook his hand, and told him that his invention had changed the course of the war. Culin, demonstrating the modesty that characterized him throughout his life, reportedly replied that he had only done what any mechanic would have done, that the idea wasn't even originally his, but that credit belonged to the soldiers who had suggested using German beach obstacles for raw material. Newspapers in the United States picked up the story and transformed Culin into a minor celebrity. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle, his hometown newspaper, published a feature article describing how a local sergeant had invented a device that revolutionized warfare in Normandy and contributed to the Allied breakthrough. The article included interviews with Culin's parents and descriptions of his pre-war life as an ordinary young man. The story fit perfectly into the American narrative of citizen soldiers, using practical ingenuity to overcome obstacles that defeated trained experts. But the recognition was incomplete and the glory fleeting. Culin remained a sergeant serving in a reconnaissance unit that was still in combat. The war did not stop for award ceremonies. Within days of receiving his medal, Culin was back with his unit, advancing through France as part of the Allied pursuit of retreating German forces. 4 months after his moment of triumph, Curtis Culin's war ended in Germany's Hürtgen Forest, November 1944. The 102nd Cavalry Group, along with numerous other American units, fought in the Hürtgen Forest, a heavily wooded area along the German-Belgian border, southeast of Aachen. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest was one of the longest and most brutal battles fought by American forces in Europe, a grinding attritional struggle in terrain that resembled the bocage in its difficulty, but with the added horrors of winter weather and fanatical German resistance on their own soil. During combat operations on November 2, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Culin was moving through the forest when he stepped on a German anti-personnel mine. The explosion shattered his left leg. He fell, and in falling detonated a second mine that severely wounded his right thigh. He was evacuated under fire by his comrades, transported to a field hospital, then evacuated through the medical chain to rear area facilities in Belgium and eventually England. Surgeons saved his life, but could not save his leg. The shattered limb was amputated. His combat service was over. Curtis Culin returned to the United States in 1945 for continued recovery and rehabilitation. He married and settled in New York City. Like millions of other veterans, he returned to civilian life and attempted to build a normal existence after years of war. He took a job as a salesman. He raised a family. He lived quietly. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences or his contribution to the Allied victory in France. On January 10, 1961, just 10 days before leaving office, outgoing President Dwight David Eisenhower delivered remarks upon receiving an award from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. In that speech, delivered before an audience of engineers and business leaders, Eisenhower chose to tell Curtis Culin's story as an example of American innovation and the critical importance of creating organizational systems that allow good ideas to rise from any level, regardless of rank or formal credentials. Eisenhower, who had been Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe and had overseen the Normandy invasion from the highest strategic level, described how a sergeant with an idea about welding steel knives to the front of tanks had solved a problem that was stalling the entire Allied advance. He emphasized that Culin's idea had been brought to the captain, to the major, to the colonel, and had gotten high enough that somebody did something about it. That somebody was General Bradley, and he had acted very quickly. Eisenhower continued, emphasizing the broader lesson. The biggest and happiest group in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew this thing worked. It saved thousands of lives. He noted that Culin had later lost a leg but was still healthy and working as a salesman in New York. The speech was Eisenhower's way of emphasizing that good ideas can come from anywhere in an organization, that leaders must create systems that allow innovation from the bottom up, and that sometimes the most important contributions come not from generals or experts but from ordinary people who see problems clearly and solve them practically. Curtis Culin III died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, New York. He was 48 years old. He was buried with military honors in Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, near his hometown of Cranford. He was laid to rest as a veteran of the 102nd Cavalry Group, recipient of the Legion of Merit, Purple Heart, and other decorations. The man whose improvised invention had broken the Normandy stalemate and contributed decisively to the Allied victory in France. The story of Curtis Culin and the hedgerow cutter has become an enduring part of American military tradition and is regularly taught at service academies and staff colleges as a case study in battlefield innovation and organizational flexibility. The story illustrates several lessons that remain relevant to military operations decades later. First, it demonstrates the critical importance of creating organizational cultures that encourage innovation at all levels of the command structure. Curtis Culin was a sergeant, an enlisted man, not an officer or a trained engineer, yet his immediate superiors were willing to listen to his idea, provide resources for testing, and forward the successful demonstration to higher command levels. This willingness to take ideas seriously regardless of their source was characteristic of the American military at its best. Second, the story illustrates the value of practical ingenuity and hands-on problem-solving over formal training and theoretical knowledge in dealing with unexpected challenges. The bocage was a tactical problem that had not been anticipated by Allied intelligence or planning staff. No doctrine existed for fighting in this type of terrain. The solution came not from high-level planning or research and development laboratories, but from a soldier on the ground who looked at the problem, thought about available materials, and figured out a practical solution. Third, the story demonstrates the critical importance of rapid implementation once a promising solution has been identified. Bradley's decision to authorize immediate mass production of the Culin device, mobilizing every ordnance unit in the American sector for round-the-clock manufacturing, transformed a single sergeant's improvisation into a force-wide capability in less than 2 weeks. This speed of implementation was possible only because American military logistics and industrial capacity were flexible enough to support rapid improvisation. The hedgerow problem itself has become a subject of extensive study in military education as an example of how even excellent intelligence can fail to identify critical tactical challenges. Allied intelligence officers had excellent aerial photography of Normandy taken in the weeks and months before D-Day. These photographs clearly showed the hedgerow landscape with its thousands of enclosed fields, but apparently no one in the intelligence chain or in the planning staff thought to ask how tanks would maneuver through this terrain or what effect these ancient field boundaries might have on tactical operations. The American soldiers who fought through the bocage in June and July 1944 experienced some of the most difficult and demoralizing combat conditions of the entire war in Europe. They fought in terrain that negated most of their advantages in firepower, mobility, and air support. They suffered casualties at rates that rivaled the worst battles of World War I, yet they persevered through courage, through discipline, through adaptation, and ultimately through innovation. The breakout from Normandy in late July and August 1944 transformed the entire war in Western Europe. Allied forces advanced from the Norman coast all the way to the German border, liberating France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the Netherlands. German forces never recovered from the catastrophic defeats suffered during the retreat across France. The road to Germany lay open. The story of Curtis Culin is ultimately a story about what happens when ordinary people confront extraordinary challenges and refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable. It is about organizational cultures that value results over credentials and are willing to listen to ideas from any source. It is about the practical American tradition of hands-on problem-solving, the belief that any problem can be solved if you think about it clearly enough and are willing to improvise with available materials. The steel prongs that Curtis Culin welded to the front of a Sherman tank in mid-June 1944 broke more than hedgerows. They broke a stalemate that had threatened to turn the greatest amphibious invasion in history into a bloody failure. They broke German confidence in their defensive strategy. They broke open the road from Normandy to Paris, from Paris to the Rhine, from the Rhine to Berlin. On that July afternoon, when Omar Bradley watched a Sherman tank crash through a hedgerow that had stopped American advances for 6 weeks, he witnessed a turning point as significant as any major battle. The solution was absurdly simple, so simple that it had baffled an entire army for more than 5 weeks. But simplicity does not diminish importance. Often the best solutions are simple. Often the most effective weapons are not the most sophisticated, but merely the ones that solve the immediate problem. Sometimes a sergeant with a welding torch and an open mind accomplishes what generals and engineers with all their training and resources cannot. The Rhino tanks rolled through France in the summer and autumn of 1944, their steel prongs cutting through obstacles that had seemed impossible, restoring mobility to American armor, enabling the rapid exploitation that carried Allied armies from Normandy to Germany. They were crude devices, improvised from scrap metal by desperate men fighting a war that had to be won. They added nothing to the firepower of the tanks they equipped. They required no advanced technology, no exotic materials, no sophisticated manufacturing. They were simply steel prongs welded to the front of tanks. But they worked, and in war, that is all that matters. Curtis Culin never sought glory or fame for his invention. He returned to civilian life after the war and lived quietly, rarely speaking of his wartime service or his role in one of the most important innovations of World War II. But history remembers him, military historians remember him, the tankers who used his device and survived battles they might otherwise have lost remember him. The greatest weapons are not always the most powerful or the most advanced. Sometimes they are simply the ones that solve the problem at hand, created by ordinary people with extraordinary insight, tested under the most demanding conditions possible, and implemented with the speed and determination that only nations fighting for survival can muster. The story of the Rhino tanks and the sergeant who invented them stands as an enduring testament to the power of innovation, the importance of organizational flexibility, and the decisive impact that individual initiative can have when leaders are wise enough to recognize good ideas and bold enough to act on them immediately. Curtis Culin's simple welding trick, conceived in desperation and executed in violation of regulations, broke the Normandy stalemate, changed the course of World War II, and helped free a continent from tyranny. That 72 hours in mid-June 1944, when a sergeant from New Jersey looked at a pile of German beach obstacles and saw salvation rather than scrap metal, reminds us that the most important innovations often come not from laboratories or planning rooms, but from the front lines where necessity drives invention and survival demands solutions that official channels cannot provide fast enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.